The millionaire humiliated his new employee without knowing he was his illegitimate son. When the truth was revealed, what happened changed both of their lives. The taxi halted in front of the imposing glass tower that loomed over the city skyline. Coleman Enterprises stood like an indomitable titan, a modern structure with reflective walls that seemed to fade into the sky. From inside the vehicle, Ethan Roberts gazed at the main entrance with a pounding heart. This place was not just a building to him, it was the culmination of years of sacrifice, effort, and a silent promise he had made to his mother. He stepped out of the taxi with the only suitcase he had brought to the city and adjusted his cheap jacket. In that moment, he looked like any young man chasing a dream. No one could have imagined that behind his determined gaze lay an unquenchable fire. Ethan looked up at the glass doors of the skyscraper and took a deep breath before stepping inside. The interior of the building was everything he had hoped for. Marble walls, modern sculptures, an atmosphere of understated luxury that exuded power and exclusivity. Employees moved with precision, as if each one had a specific and urgent mission to accomplish. Men and women in designer suits walked through the hallways, some engaged in animated conversations, others focused on their phones or tablets, oblivious to their surroundings. To them, Ethan was nothing more than a shadow that had just entered their world. "How can I assist you?" asked the receptionist, a young and stylish woman who didn't even look up from her monitor. Her tone was cold and professional, and Ethan instantly knew he would have to earn every ounce of respect here. "Ethan Roberts, new analyst in the finance department," he replied firmly, presenting his ID. The receptionist glanced up, assessed him from head to toe, and without a word, handed him a visitor pass. "The Human Resources Department is on the 14th floor. They will direct you to where you need to go." Ethan nodded and made his way toward the elevators, feeling sweat beginning to form in the palms of his hands. It wasn't nervous sweat. It was sweat from anticipation. He had waited so long for this moment that the thought of taking the first step toward his goal felt almost unreal. He stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the 14th floor, and stared at his own reflection in the metal walls of the lift. A young man with dark hair, deep-set eyes, and a strong jaw stared back at him with determination. He was not the typical newly hired employee hoping to make his way quietly. Ethan knew exactly who he was, even if no one else here did yet. Upon reaching the 14th floor, he was greeted by the HR team with polite coldness. After signing some documents and receiving a brief tour of the facilities, they led him to his office. Ethan held back a wry smile at the sight of his office, a small cubicle in the farthest corner of the floor, windowless, with an old desk cluttered with disorganized papers. It was the kind of place where rookies and those still needing to prove their worth were relegated. "This will be your workstation, Ethan," announced his new supervisor, a stocky man in a grey suit that fit a bit snugly. "Don't expect much support, and don't take it personally if others don't pay you much attention. We're all busy here." Ethan nodded and took a seat, observing his surroundings. The office atmosphere was a mix of frenetic activity and silent competition. The top-level analysts moved confidently from side to side, each trying to outdo the other. They hardly noticed one another, each focused on their own goals. But Ethan wasn't there to compete with them. His true rivals were the ones sitting at the top of the company, in spacious offices with stunning views. And to reach them, he would have to carve his path from the shadows. The first few days passed, and as he was warned, Ethan was completely ignored. He was assigned monotonous tasks filled with numbers and overdue reports that no one wanted to review. However, instead of becoming discouraged, Ethan stayed late every night, scrutinizing every line of data, every figure, searching for errors and hidden patterns. He began to notice minor inconsistencies, small discrepancies in the numbers that no one had pointed out. So he started emailing his superiors with recommendations to fix the mistakes. At first, no one replied, but everything changed when, in his third week, one of his reports averted a loss of several $100,000 in an international project. A simple adjustment in an Excel formula that had gone unnoticed by the senior team had saved the operation. Overnight, Ethan ceased to be an invisible employee. Although no one openly acknowledged him, whispers began. "Who is that new guy?" He heard more than once behind his back. Supervisors looked at him with a mix of interest and suspicion. Some began to approach his cubicle to ask for his opinion on other reports. Ethan knew this was just the beginning. He had ignited a spark, and now it was up to him to keep it burning. But he also knew that in a place like Coleman Enterprises, standing out too soon could be dangerous. The bigger sharks started to circle when they sensed a smaller fish moving too fast, and one of those sharks was Henry Coleman. Henry appeared in his office one afternoon after hearing how the new analyst had solved a problem his own team had overlooked. He was a man of impeccable appearance, with an elegant demeanor and a sharp smile. He stood next to Ethan's cubicle, watching him with a calculating gaze. "You're the famous Ethan Roberts, aren't you?" he asked in a smooth voice. Ethan stood up immediately. Although Henry was not his direct boss, he was the owner's son and the natural heir to the Coleman empire. "Yes, Mr. Coleman. A pleasure. They say you've been doing a good job." "Too good, I'd say." Henry tilted his head, scrutinizing him with an expression that blended curiosity and disdain. "But let me make one thing clear. No one stands out more than me around here. Understood?" Ethan felt the tension in the air. This was not a casual remark. It was a warning, but he didn't let the threat intimidate him. Keeping his composure, he nodded. "Understood, sir." "Good," Henry murmured, his smile fading. "From now on, you'll work directly on the expansion project we're preparing. I want you focused. We'll see if you're as good as they say." And so, Ethan was thrown into the belly of the corporate hell. The expansion project was a maze of legal and logistical issues that had left several seasoned managers looking foolish. Henry knew the chances of success were slim, but his intention was not to see Ethan succeed, but to watch him fail. Even so, Ethan did not back down. He spent sleepless nights researching, gathering information, seeking solutions, and negotiating with reluctant suppliers. The spark he had ignited with his first success began to gain momentum, but now he had entered the radar of the real players, and what he didn't know was that his greatest enemy was not Henry, but the very man who was watching his progress from the top of the tower, Richard Coleman. The first chapter of his new life had begun. The clock struck 8 in the evening, and the finance department of Coleman Enterprises began to empty. Cubicles shut down one by one, leaving the area in dim light. However, in the farthest corner of the floor, a small light still remained on. It was Ethan Roberts' office, now burdened with a new and challenging project, expansion into a troubled area of the city. A project that others had avoided like the plague, and that Henry Coleman, with a mocking smile and false motivational words, had assigned him just to see him fail. Ethan stared at his computer monitor, his eyes fixed on a detailed report of the target area. The project was a puzzle tangled in bureaucracy and chaos, filled with legal complications and logistical challenges. The numbers didn't add up, construction permits were stuck, and local suppliers demanded absurd conditions to collaborate. It was a carefully laid minefield for him to fall into. But Ethan refused to yield. He gritted his teeth and took a breath. If Henry thought he would fail with this impossible task, he was about to receive the surprise of his life. As he continued to work in his small office upstairs, Henry Coleman was in a conference room with several executives. The conversation revolved around the new guy and his ability to solve problems that others had overlooked. Henry kept his jaw clenched, listening to the executives praise Ethan with growing resentment. "Robertson seems to have an eye for detail," commented one of the senior analysts, looking at some charts. "That guy spotted inconsistencies in less than a week that our own team took months to miss." "It's Roberts," Henry corrected sharply, "and it's not that impressive. He just got lucky. But the discomfort on his face told a different story. No matter how hard he tried to discredit Ethan, the fact was that the executives were beginning to take an interest in him. And in the world of Coleman Enterprises, the attention of the board was something dangerous for anyone who wasn't a Coleman. Henry frowned, scheming new ways to make Ethan's life miserable. If he wanted to survive in this shark-infested environment, Ethan would either sink or swim, and Henry would make sure he didn't survive. Days turned into weeks. Ethan worked from dawn until late at night, meeting with reluctant suppliers, negotiating with local authorities, and navigating every obstacle that appeared in his path. The job required not only analytical skills, but also immense negotiation abilities and adaptability to the constantly changing market conditions. Henry, from his privileged office, watched Ethan from a distance, eagerly waiting for the moment he would crack under the pressure. However, to Henry's surprise, Ethan not only met the impossible tasks assigned to him, but began to show tangible results. He managed to unblock some legal permits that had been stalled for months and convinced local suppliers to sign contracts with more favorable terms for the company. Rumors of his success began to spread through the office like uncontrollable wildfire. "That guy's achieving what others couldn't," employees murmured in the hallways. "Who is he exactly?" some asked, glancing toward Ethan's small office with curiosity. The expansion project had become an unexpected focal point, and this did not please Henry at all. If Ethan continued like this, his own status in the company could be threatened. Determined to regain control, Henry called a special meeting with the operations team, including Ethan. The conference room was lit by modern design lamps and decorated with abstract paintings, attempting to give it an air of sophistication. The top executives of the company were seated on either side of the table, and Henry occupied the head of it. Ethan walked in, carrying a folder full of reports and data under his arm. It was the first time he found himself in such a high-level meeting, and he could feel the executives' gazes fixed on him. Some were curious, others disdainful, but none were supportive. "Well, Roberts," Henry said, emphasizing his last name with a venomous tone, "we're curious to know how you plan to proceed with this project, since apparently you've made some progress that others haven't been able to achieve." The executives exchanged glances. It was clear that Henry was not here to congratulate him. This was a test, an attempt to humiliate him. Ethan stood up, spread the charts and reports across the table, and began to speak. His voice was calm and controlled. He explained how he had secured contracts with local suppliers at competitive prices, how he had unlocked some complicated municipal permits, and how he had a detailed plan to resolve the logistical issues that had stalled the project until now. With each word, the executives' faces grew more serious. Even Henry shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Impressive," one of the executives commented at the end of the presentation. "It seems you've made much more progress than we expected. How did you manage to get the local suppliers to accept those terms? I understand they've been problematic in the past." "Simple," Ethan replied, looking Henry directly in the eye. "I made sure they understood that this project was more than just an expansion. I showed them how it would benefit not only the company, but also their own operations in the long run. Sometimes, numbers aren't enough to convince someone. You have to show them the bigger picture." Henry clenched his fists under the table. He knew what Ethan was insinuating. Where Henry had failed with his authoritarian and domineering approach, Ethan had succeeded with a more collaborative and diplomatic one. It was a defeat for Henry, but he didn't intend to leave it at that. That same night, while Ethan was working in his office, Henry barged in unannounced. He closed the door behind him and glared at Ethan with a furious expression. "Who do you think you are?" he growled, stepping closer with determined strides. "Do you think you can come in here and win everyone over with that false humility and your supposed brilliance? You're a nobody, understand? This is my territory." Ethan remained calm, although his heart raced. Slowly, he stood up from his seat and faced him. I'm not here to take anything from you, Henry. I'm just doing my job." "Your job is to do what I say." Henry pointed an accusing finger at him. "So you're going to fail on this project. You'll get yourself fired and be out of this company, because I warn you, I won't allow you to steal what's mine." Ethan watched him in silence. He understood what Henry was feeling, the fear of losing his position, the resentment towards someone he saw as a threat. But instead of responding with anger, he nodded slowly. "I understand," he said softly, "but you can't destroy me just because I exist, Henry, and you can't stop me from doing my job well. If you expect me to fail, then get ready to be disappointed." Henry glared at him with pure hatred, and with a snort of contempt, he turned and left the office, leaving Ethan alone. But as he watched him go, Ethan felt something more than fear or worry. He felt a new drive, a spark of defiance. If Henry wanted to turn this project into a battlefield, then he would fight. Because this wasn't just a job. This was war, and Ethan had no intention of giving up. From that moment on, the competition between them intensified. Henry ramped up the pressure, sending lower-ranking employees to interfere with Ethan's orders, manipulating deadlines and sabotaging every small achievement. But Ethan didn't break. With every new obstacle, he found a solution. With every setback, he made progress, and with every attack from Henry, his determination grew stronger. Ethan's name began to appear more frequently in internal reports and high-level meetings. Executives started to wonder if this young man was not just a lucky rookie, but someone with the potential to make a real mark in the company. Meanwhile, from his office at the top of the tower, Richard Coleman watched, with growing interest, the young man daring to challenge the established order. Unbeknownst to him, Ethan had ignited the first spark of a conflict that would change the Coleman family's fate forever. The Coleman mansion, perched on a hill with a panoramic view of the city, reflected a perfect blend of opulence and power. In its spacious and luxurious salons, adorned with exclusive artwork and exquisite antiques, there was always an air of absolute control, a silent authority that permeated every corner of the residence. At the center of all this power was Grace Coleman, the matriarch of the family. Sitting in her elegant study, her delicate hands crossed over a mahogany desk, she calmly flipped through a dossier, though her eyes reflected an internal storm. The name, Ethan Roberts, appeared repeatedly in the documents. There was something about him that didn't fit. Grace hadn't reached the pinnacle of corporate power solely through her marriage to Richard. Her true strength lay in her ability to detect threats before they even manifested. And Ethan was undoubtedly a threat. Despite being a newcomer, he had begun to gain the attention of the board, and worse yet, her son Henry spoke of him with a mix of hatred and impotence. Grace slid her index finger down the page, following the lines of text with precision. There was hardly any information about the young man before his entry into Coleman Enterprises. A degree in economics, some work experience at small local companies, but nothing relevant. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere, with no history, no roots. Grace looked up at the wide window overlooking the mansion's garden and sighed. She knew the pattern. People like him, with no past, always hid something. Something that needed to be uncovered before it became a real problem. "Mother, are you busy?" Henry's voice pulled her from her thoughts. Henry entered without waiting for an invitation, his face tense and brow furrowed. Grace narrowed her eyes. "Still on about Ethan?" she asked in a patient yet firm tone. Henry gritted his teeth. "Yes, and I assure you I can't stand it any longer. He's winning over the executives, can't you see? They're holding him up as an example in board meetings. It's bad enough being compared to Dad, but now it's that damn kid making me look incompetent." Grace watched him in silence. Henry, her beloved son, had always been weak compared to his older brother, who had tragically died in an accident years ago. Since then, she had shaped Henry to take the reins of the company, to be the next leader. But Henry's insecurities were a fragile ground on which to build the future of the Coleman Empire. If he lost control now, everything she had fought for would come crashing down. Calm down, Henry, she whispered gently. I'm investigating Ethan Roberts. Soon, we'll know everything we need. That's not enough! Henry spun around, slamming his hand on the desk. That guy is challenging me, and I won't allow it. If we don't get rid of him soon, he'll ruin everything. Grace looked at him coldly. This was not the time for Henry to be carried away by his emotions. You must keep your composure. If we rush, we'll only give him more power. First, we need to understand who he really is. You can't destroy what you don't comprehend. Henry stared at her for a long moment, his eyes flashing with fury. Then he nodded brusquely and left the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Grace picked up the dossier again and opened it to the last page, where a single name captured her attention: Martha Roberts. It was a name she hadn't heard in many, many years. Grace felt a shiver run down her spine. She remembered Martha as a shadow from Richard's past, a woman of serene and dignified beauty, but more importantly, a woman who had abruptly disappeared from Richard's life when he married her. She had never suspected there was any connection between them all these years. But now, the idea that Martha might have a son raised alarms in her mind. Grace squinted, her thin lips curling into a self-satisfied smile. If Martha was Ethan's mother, that could only mean one thing. He was the product of a betrayal, an illegitimate child of her husband. As Grace unearthed the past, Ethan continued to work tirelessly in his small cubicle at Coleman Enterprises. The rumors about his success in the expansion project spread quickly, and although he tried to keep away from the spotlight, he knew he had entered the dangerous game of corporate politics. What he didn't realize was that he was no longer just dealing with Henry's animosity. Someone much more dangerous had started pulling strings against him. That afternoon, while reviewing supplier contracts, an unexpected email popped up in his inbox. It was from his direct supervisor, asking him to report to Richard Coleman's office at 6 in the evening for a progress review. Ethan felt his heart stop. Richard Coleman, the owner of the company. Until now, Richard had remained a distant figure, a legendary name that rarely intruded on minor matters. Why would he want to see him now? He made sure to bring all relevant reports and documentation before heading to the conference room. The meeting was brief but intense. Richard observed him with calculating eyes as Ethan presented his progress with clarity and confidence. There was something in the mogul's gaze that made him nervous, as if he were weighing something beyond Ethan's job performance. "Impressive, Roberts," Richard said at the end of the presentation, his voice betraying no emotion. "But tell me, what is it that you really want from this company?" Ethan felt a knot in his stomach. This wasn't a question about the project, nor even about his future at Coleman Enterprises. It was a question about his intentions, about who he really was. Despite the coldness he felt, he maintained his composure and answered as sincerely as possible. "I just want to prove my capability and have a positive impact on the projects assigned to me, sir." Richard didn't respond immediately. He merely nodded, and after a few seconds of uncomfortable silence, he rose from his seat. "I hope that's the case, Ethan, because in this company we do not tolerate mediocrity or hidden agendas." Richard leaned slightly toward him with an enigmatic expression. "Remember these words well." Ethan left the meeting feeling unsettled. Something in Richard's tone had felt more like a warning than advice. He couldn't shake the thought of whether Henry had spoken to his father. Were they plotting something against him? He had no proof, but his instinct told him to be careful. The next day, the situation grew even more complicated. The expansion project documents that Ethan had worked tirelessly on for weeks had disappeared from his computer. He spent the entire morning trying to recover them, only to find there was no trace of them in the system. Anyone else would have despaired, but Ethan kept calm. He knew someone wanted to make him look incompetent and disorganized. He called an emergency meeting with his team and explained the situation coolly. However, he noticed something strange. The employees under his charge, who had previously worked efficiently and organized, now looked at him with distrust and hostility. It was as if someone had silently undermined his authority. That was when Henry appeared in his office with a satisfied smile. "Problems, Roberts?" he inquired with feigned concern. Ethan clenched his fists under the desk, but kept his voice neutral. "Nothing I can't resolve, sir." "I hope so. Because believe me, in this company, there's only room for those who adapt quickly." Henry stepped closer, leaning over Ethan's desk. "And you don't have much time to prove it." Grace, from her office in the mansion, held an old photo of Richard and Martha together. The expression of tenderness on her husband's face made her grip the photo tightly. This wasn't just a corporate threat, it was something much more personal. If Ethan was indeed Richard's illegitimate son, then his presence could destroy everything she had built. She needed to act swiftly and precisely, or risk losing it all. "So, you're Martha's son. Good," she whispered in a chilling voice. "We'll see how long you can survive." Grace Coleman was not a woman to be driven by fear. Over the years, she had faced powerful adversaries, navigated betrayals, and maintained a firm grip on the family and the empire of Richard Coleman. But at this moment, as she looked at the wrinkled photo of Martha and Richard together, an unsettling feeling enveloped her. It wasn't fear for herself, but for the fragile balance she had maintained within the Coleman family for so long. If Ethan Roberts, or rather Ethan Coleman, survived this storm, the family legacy and her own control over Richard could crumble. The photograph slipped from her fingers and fell onto her desk. The image stared back at her from the past, a silent mockery of all her efforts. She closed her eyes for a moment and made a decision. She had to destroy Ethan before he even suspected his true origin. But doing it clumsily or impulsively would only raise suspicions. Grace was a master manipulator, and she knew the pieces had to move with subtlety and precision. And for that, she had the perfect pawn. Henry. The next day, Henry Coleman arrived at the office with renewed energy. The last few days had been chaotic for him, with rumors swirling about Ethan's rise and whispers among executives questioning his competence. But that morning, his mother had summoned him to her office and spoken to him in a tone that left no room for doubt. Henry was not a natural strategist. He had spent his life competing to meet his family's expectations, but he had never learned how to play the long game. Now, with his mother's influence, he finally had a clear plan. Henry headed to the Human Resources Department and, with a tense smile, discreetly requested access to Ethan's call and email logs. He knew it was illegal and risky, but Henry was determined to unearth any mistake, any misstep he could use against him. If he could prove that Ethan had violated any company policy, he could not only humiliate him, but also ruin his career. The pressure from his mother was the fuel that ignited his vengeful fire. "Mr. Coleman, the records you requested," said the HR director, an expression of discomfort on her face. "Leave them in my office," Henry replied curtly, not bothering to look at her. He spent the next few hours reviewing every communication, every exchange of emails and internal messages. Most of the conversations were professional and cold, but something caught his attention: an email exchange between Ethan and a contractor in the target area. The words seemed innocent, but from the right angle, Henry knew he could make them appear suspicious. It was a message about a change in contract conditions, something completely normal in such a complicated project. But if he could distort the context... With a gleam in his eyes, Henry printed the pages and took them directly to his mother. Grace scrutinized the papers closely. "So Ethan is making deals outside official channels," she murmured, a small smile creeping onto her lips. She knew it wasn't true, but in the corporate world, the perception of truth often mattered more than reality. It was enough to sow doubts, to create a climate of suspicion. "This isn't definitive, Mother, but it's a start. If I can gather a bit more information, I can take it to the board," Henry said impatiently. Grace looked up, her cold eyes piercing into her son. Don't be impatient, Henry. We don't want Ethan to simply be fired. We want him to destroy himself. If we press too hard too soon, he'll raise suspicions. No, we need to isolate him, make him doubt everyone, erode every relationship he's built here. Henry nodded slowly. His mother's plan began to take shape in his mind. It was about discrediting Ethan, making him believe the company was against him, and then pushing him into a mistake he couldn't reverse. The perfect trap. And they would do it in small steps without raising suspicions. Over the next few weeks, Grace moved with the subtlety of a master puppeteer. She used her influence to infiltrate loyal people into Ethan's team. Every time Ethan made a decision, there was someone leaking distorted information to the executives. Whenever he achieved a small success, someone quietly sabotaged it, presenting things in a way that made it seem like Ethan was taking credit for others' achievements. Employees began to look at him with distrust. Rumors of his supposed excessive ambition spread like wildfire. One morning, Ethan arrived at the office to find two members of his team discussing in hushed tones. As he approached, their voices fell silent immediately. "Is something wrong?" Ethan asked, looking at his employees. "It's just," one of them began, avoiding eye contact. "We've heard you're being considered for a higher position on the board." Ethan frowned, surprised. "That's not true." "But that's what they're saying," insisted the other, with an accusing look. "And they say you've been moving behind Henry's back to win the executive's favor." Ethan felt a pang of concern. Who was spreading these lies? He looked at the employees, who were now watching him with suspicious eyes, as if he were the real enemy. He decided not to dwell on it at that moment, but inside he knew this wasn't a simple coincidence. Someone was trying to manipulate everyone's perceptions against him. As Ethan struggled to maintain his reputation, Claire Coleman, Henry's younger sister, began to notice the changes in the office dynamics. Ever since Ethan had arrived, something had shifted in the atmosphere of Coleman Enterprises. The environment had become tenser, more hostile. But what troubled her the most was her mother's and brother's behavior. Every time she mentioned Ethan at family gatherings, Grace quickly changed the subject, and Henry would explode in fury. Something was off. One afternoon, Claire decided to confront Henry directly. She found him in his office, frowning as he reviewed some documents. Without hesitation, she entered and closed the door behind her. "What the hell are you doing with Ethan, Henry?" she asked coldly. Henry looked up, surprised by her tone. "It's none of your business, Claire." "It is when I see you obsessing over destroying him. What has he done to you to inspire such hatred?" Claire crossed her arms, her gaze piercing into him. Henry shot up abruptly, his hands trembling. "It's not hatred, he's stealing everything from me. Since he arrived, everyone looks at him like he's some kind of hero. That position is mine. This company is mine." Claire stepped forward, unafraid. "You're a damn coward, Henry. If you truly believe he's surpassing you, then prove to him you're his equal. But this, manipulating everyone behind his back. Do you really think Mom will protect you forever?" Henry fell silent, clenching his fists. Claire looked at him with disdain and turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "And if Mom is behind all this," she murmured harshly, "she's making a mistake too. Because Ethan isn't just some regular employee. Something tells me we have no idea who he really is." That very night, Grace received an anonymous message. She opened her email and froze. The attached photo showed a young Richard Coleman holding a newborn baby with Martha beside him, smiling. The words accompanying the photo were simple but chilling. "He knows." The dossier fell from her hands. Ethan was not just a professional threat. If Richard found out who he really was, her control over him would vanish forever. Her marriage, her position in the family, everything was at stake. With trembling hands, she shut her computer and pressed her lips into a thin line. If she wanted to destroy Ethan, she would have to do it quickly. because now the truth was dangerously close to coming to light. "It's time to end this," she murmured to herself. Ethan's office at Coleman Enterprises, though small and tucked away, had been his refuge for the past few months. The walls were covered with charts, documents, and sticky notes, all related to the expansion project that had dominated his life. But that morning, when Ethan arrived at his office, he felt something had changed. A heavy atmosphere seemed to envelop every corner of the company. The employees' gazes were evasive, whispers were more frequent, and above all, there was an unsettling silence surrounding him, as if everyone knew something he did not. Ethan sat at his desk and powered on his computer. When he checked his inbox, he found an email with the subject line, "Urgent Progress Review, Presentation to the Board of Directors." The meeting was scheduled for that very afternoon, and although Ethan had submitted reports regularly, the word urgent made him frown. Something was off. He decided to waste no time and began reviewing his documents, ensuring everything was in order. Time flew by, and before he knew it, it was time for the meeting. As he walked toward the conference room, he noticed employees avoiding eye contact with him. Some even murmured quietly, their faces tense as if bracing for an impending disaster. Upon entering the conference room, he found the entire board of directors present. Everyone was there. Henry, with his poorly concealed, smug expression, Grace, with her usual calm yet watchful demeanor, and at the end of the table, Richard Coleman, observing him with impenetrable eyes. "Sit down, Roberts," Richard said in a cold voice. Ethan complied, feeling the temperature in the room drop several degrees. As he settled in, he noticed a thick folder in front of each of the directors. The heading on the document chilled him to the bone. "Internal Investigation, Illegal Activities and Conflict of Interest." Ethan looked up, surprised, but maintained his composure. "What is this?" he asked, glancing at those present. Henry was the first to respond. "This, Roberts, is proof that you have been operating behind the company's back. We knew you liked to draw attention, but we never thought you would go this far." He gestured to one of the assistants, who immediately connected a presentation to the projector. The screen displayed a series of emails, all apparently sent by Ethan, suggesting changes to contract terms and price adjustments without the consent of his superiors. The emails were edited in such a way that they seemed to involve Ethan in a scheme to divert project funds to external accounts. Ethan felt a knot in his stomach. He stood up, hands open in a gesture of disbelief. "This isn't true. Those emails have been manipulated. I never approved those changes, and the accounts they mention, I don't even know them." "Manipulated?" Henry scoffed. "Is that how you plan to defend yourself? These pieces of evidence were verified by our internal security team. Every document, every transaction, every conversation was reviewed. And unfortunately for you, they all point in one direction, that you tried to destabilize this project and divert it for your own benefit." "That's ridiculous," Ethan protested, looking desperately at Richard. "Mr. Coleman, you know I've worked tirelessly to make this project a success. I've been here night after night, solving problems others couldn't. Do you think I would risk doing something like this?" Richard didn't respond. His eyes, hard as steel, remained fixed on Ethan. Next to him, Grace leaned forward, a small smile of satisfaction on her face. "Ethan," she said softly, almost maternally, "there's no need for you to keep lying. You're not the first ambitious employee to try to climb too fast. But what you've done is not just dishonest, it's illegal. And the company has no place for people like you." "I haven't done anything I'm accused of," Ethan exclaimed, feeling desperation swell inside him. "If only I could review the original documents, I would prove to you that someone is manipulating the evidence." "Manipulating?" Grace shook her head slowly, feigning sadness. "Ethan, the evidence is conclusive, and I'm afraid you don't have time to keep making excuses." "Mr. Coleman," Ethan looked at Richard desperately, "let me show you the truth. Give me a chance to defend myself. I just need access to the original files and—" "There's no need for that," Richard interrupted him with a curt voice. "What I see here is enough for me. You're fired, Roberts, effective immediately." The words fell like a hammer on his heart. Ethan felt as if the world was collapsing around him. They had caught him in a perfect trap. Grace had moved her pieces with surgical precision, and Henry, with his visceral hatred, had been the tool that pushed him into the abyss. The murmurs in the boardroom were disapproving. The executives, who had begun to see Ethan as a promise, now looked at him with disdain. He was a pariah. The humiliation was complete when Richard stood up and looked at him coldly. "I want you to leave this building immediately," he said in a low but firm voice, "and never come back." Ethan swallowed hard, feeling anger and pain mixing inside him. He looked Richard in the eye, his face hardened. "One day, you will know the truth," he murmured, "and then you will regret treating me this way." Richard didn't respond. He simply turned and walked out of the room, followed by Grace and Henry. Henry's last glance was one of pure satisfaction. He had won, and he knew it. Ethan, with his body rigid and his heart broken, gathered his things and exited the conference room. The hallway was filled with employees watching him with looks of pity and disdain. Some murmured, while others looked away. It was as if he were already dead to them. Ethan walked out of the building with a heavy heart. The rain began to fall gently over the city, and he wandered aimlessly, feeling each drop weigh on his soul. He had lost not only his job, but also the opportunity to avenge his mother and prove that he was capable. He had worked so hard, only to have everything taken from him in the blink of an eye. He walked for hours, unsure of where to go. The city lights shone like artificial stars, oblivious to his pain. Finally, he stopped in front of an old cafe, the same cafe he used to go to with his mother as a child. He sat on a bench outside the establishment and let the tears stream down his face. It was then that his phone rang. It was from the hospital. "Martha Roberts," said a voice on the other end, "has worsened dramatically. You should come as soon as possible." Ethan's heart stopped. All the suffering, all the despair, paled in comparison to what those words meant. He ran to the hospital, feeling his entire life crumbling around him. When he arrived, the room was dim. Martha, his beloved mother, lay in bed, pale and weak. Her eyes opened slightly when she sensed Ethan's presence. "Mom," he whispered, taking her hand, "I lost everything. They took it all from me." Martha could barely smile. With titanic effort, she raised her other trembling hand and caressed her son's face. "Ethan, it doesn't matter what you lose. What matters is who you are." "Mom, I'm sorry," he whispered, feeling tears streaming down his face. "I couldn't protect you. I couldn't prove anything." "You are stronger than you think," Martha murmured. Her eyes began to close slowly. "You have something they will never have. You have truth." Ethan leaned toward her, sobbing, and then Martha, with her last strength, whispered the words that would change his life forever. "Richard is your father. Richard Coleman." Ethan froze, feeling as if the world had come to a halt. The revelation hit him like lightning in the midst of a storm. Richard Coleman. The man who had just destroyed him, who had ruthlessly fired him, was his own father. "Mom, what are you saying?" he whispered, his voice breaking. But Martha could no longer respond. Her eyes closed slowly, and with one last breath, she was gone. Ethan was left alone, kneeling beside his mother's bed, feeling how rage, sadness, and hatred transformed into an unstoppable torrent. Richard Coleman had not only taken everything from him, he had taken his mother and had destroyed his life before he even knew the truth. Ethan slowly stood up, his hands clenched into fists. He looked at himself in the hospital room mirror, his face streaked with tears, and murmured in a low but determined voice, "I will avenge you, Mum. I promise. Richard Coleman will pay for everything." His life had changed forever. The main office of Coleman Enterprises, located on the top floor of the imposing tower, had become a boiling cauldron of chaos. The past few days had been hell for the Coleman family and their business empire. Since Ethan's firing, things had only worsened. Rumors of his departure had spread quickly throughout the building, and what began as whispers about a corrupt employee soon transformed into a torrent of doubts and speculation. Low-level employees began to question the validity of the accusations. How could someone like Ethan, such a brilliant and dedicated young man, have been a traitor? The comments in the hallways, the distrustful glances and the hushed murmurs began to affect the work environment. But the worst was yet to come. The shareholders, always alert to any movement that could jeopardize their investments, began to demand answers. Richard Coleman, sitting in his luxurious office overlooking the entire city, felt the pressure swirling around him like a storm. Henry, who had temporarily taken over the expansion project, had only plunged it further into failure. The legal and logistical issues that Ethan had navigated with such skill had multiplied since his departure. The suppliers, once willing to collaborate, now hesitated, and some had even pulled out of agreements. The local authorities who had previously listened to Ethan's proposals were now dismissing Henry's with vague arguments, but it was clear that something had broken. On his desk, Richard had the latest financial reports. The numbers didn't lie. The value of Coleman Enterprises stock had begun to waver. Investors were nervous, and the once loyal board members were starting to express their doubts. But what worried him most were the growing murmurs among the employees. Anonymous messages began appearing on the bulletin boards, notes insinuating that Ethan had been a scapegoat, that he had been betrayed by someone above. The seed of distrust had been planted and was germinating at an alarming rate. Richard ran a hand through his graying hair, staring at the reports as if they could provide him with answers. But the truth was that he didn't understand what had gone wrong. He had fired Ethan with irrefutable evidence, hadn't he? So why did he feel everything was crumbling? He stood up and walked to the window, gazing at the city he had dominated for so long. Something inside him told him he had made a mistake, but his pride wouldn't allow him to admit it. The door to his office swung open abruptly, and Henry stormed in with an angry expression. His normally pale face was flushed with rage and desperation. "This is a disaster!" he exclaimed, slamming a file onto Richard's desk. "The suppliers are pulling out, the employees treat me like a pariah, and the board is losing confidence in me, all because you fired that damn traitor." Richard looked at him sternly. "And what did you expect, Henry? You're in charge now. If you can't keep control, that's not Ethan's fault." "How can you say that?" Henry clenched his fists tightly. "All of this started because of him. If he had never come here, if he had never tried to take what is ours, none of this would have happened. And now the board is talking about ousting me." Richard felt a pang of pain seeing his son so shattered. Henry had always struggled to be taken seriously, to prove that he was a worthy leader. But every mistake he made pushed him closer to the brink of failure. And now, the thought of losing everything consumed him. "We won't let that happen," Richard said in a low voice. "We must stand firm." Henry let out a bitter laugh. "Firm? There's nothing left to be firm about. Don't you see, Father? Ethan has gotten what he wanted. He has destroyed us." Richard turned to face Henry, but before he could respond, the door opened again. This time it was Grace who entered, her face unusually tense. There was a shadow of worry in her eyes, a glimmer she rarely showed. "Henry, Richard, we have a bigger problem," she said in a controlled voice. "I just received a call from the board. They've called it an extraordinary meeting for tomorrow." Richard frowned. "Why?" Grace looked at Henry sternly. Someone has been leaking confidential information to the press. Not only about Ethan's dismissal, but also about the internal manipulations that you, Henry, and I have made to discredit him. Henry was left speechless. That's impossible. No one knows anything about it. Only the trusted executives. Well, it seems someone else knows, Grace cut in, her face pale. If we don't do something, the board could oust Henry, and if they investigate thoroughly, they might discover the truth. They could find out who Ethan really is. The air in the room froze. Richard slowly turned to his wife, his gaze sharp as a knife. "What are you talking about?" he asked quietly, but with an underlying threat. Grace hesitated. She had never feared Richard, but at that moment, seeing the fire in his eyes sent a chill down her spine. However, she knew she could no longer keep it hidden. "Ethan isn't just an employee, Richard," she murmured. He is Martha's son. He's your son." The confession dropped in the room like a bomb. Henry staggered back, stunned, and Richard felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. His son. Ethan was his son. "That's not possible," Henry exclaimed, staring at his mother as if she had struck him. "What are you saying?" "What you hear," Grace said with calculated coldness. "Martha, the woman Richard was with before marrying me, had a child, Ethan. And now that child is here, in our company, destabilizing everything we've built." Richard sank into his chair, feeling the weight of the world crash down on him. "Ethan, my son," he murmured, almost to himself. Everything made sense now. The intelligence, the determination, the talent, things he had noticed in Ethan but attributed to mere coincidence. Now he realized the truth, and the pain of knowing he had destroyed his own son without knowing who he truly was hit him with devastating force. "Richard, we can't let this come to light," Grace whispered, leaning toward him. "If the board finds out, if the world finds out, everything we've worked for will come crashing down. Ethan must be eliminated from the equation, permanently." Richard looked up at his wife with a look of disbelief. Eliminate him? His own son? "No," he whispered hoarsely. "I can't." "You have to do it," Grace insisted, desperation flashing in her eyes. "If not, we'll lose everything." But Richard shook his head slowly. He couldn't bear the thought of destroying Ethan, not now that he knew the truth. He had made many mistakes in his life, but this would be unforgivable. "No, Grace," he said firmly, rising. "We won't do anything, because tomorrow at that board meeting, I'm going to confess everything." "You can't do that," Henry shouted. "It will destroy you and us. They'll think you're crazy." Richard looked at his son sadly. "I no longer care what they think. The only thing that matters to me now is trying to make amends for this mistake. I can't keep destroying my own family." Henry looked to his mother, seeking support, but Grace turned her gaze away. She knew she had lost. If Richard spoke, everything would crumble. And the worst part was that there was nothing she could do to stop him. That night, as the Coleman mansion fell into ominous silence, Ethan watched from the darkness, his face hardened by pain and anger. He had heard everything, thanks to the devices he had planted in Richard's office. He knew the truth. He knew that Richard was his father, and that Grace had tried to destroy him. The revelation brought no relief, only more hatred. But it also brought something else, a purpose. "Tomorrow," he murmured to himself, his eyes fixed on the Coleman Enterprises tower. "Tomorrow will be the beginning of the end for the Colemans." He was ready to deliver the final blow. The drama was intensifying. The family conflict was now exposed, and the internal war had only just begun. The atmosphere in the boardroom of Coleman Enterprises was thick with tension. The top executives, each used to moving millions of dollars with a single gesture, now sat in their uncomfortable seats, watching Richard Coleman with expectant and nervous gazes. The news of the extraordinary meeting had leaked to all levels of the company, and the employees, normally focused on their tasks, murmured among themselves, exchanging theories about what might happen. Richard looked at each of those present with a solemn expression. Never in his life had he felt such a weight on his shoulders. He had faced financial crises, legal battles, and betrayals from his own partners, but none of that compared to what he was about to do. Because he knew that when he spoke, he wouldn't just be jeopardizing his legacy, but also exposing the lies and manipulations that had supported the Coleman family for decades. Richard took a deep breath and set the dossier he was holding on the table. Inside, every word burned in his throat, but the truth had to come to light. "Thank you all for attending this extraordinary meeting," he began with a firm voice, though his gaze reflected an internal storm. "Today, I want to address a matter of utmost importance for the future of our company and for my family." The board members exchanged glances, surprised by Richard's unusually somber tone. Henry, sitting across the table, shifted uncomfortably, his face pale and hands trembling. Grace, beside him, maintained a tense and controlled expression, but her eyes kept darting from side to side as if searching for an escape. Before Richard could continue, the boardroom door swung open with a sharp bang. Everyone present turned toward the entrance, and the air seemed to stop. Ethan Roberts, the man everyone thought was banished, entered the room with terrifying calm. Dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, with a serene face and a determined look, he walked toward the head of the table where Richard sat and stopped just a few steps away from him. "What does this mean?" Henry exclaimed, suddenly standing up. His voice reflected panic and fury. "You're not supposed to be here. You're fired." Ethan didn't even glance at him. His attention was completely focused on Richard, who was watching him with a mix of astonishment, pain, and something that could have been respect. "Mr. Coleman," Ethan said in a soft voice, but strong enough for everyone to hear, "before you continue with your statement, I believe it would be wise for everyone here to see the truth." With a precise movement, he pulled a small remote from his pocket and pressed it. The screen behind Richard sprang to life, and what appeared there left everyone dumbfounded. It was a video showing Henry and Grace in Henry's office, openly discussing how they had manipulated the evidence to frame Ethan, how they had twisted the truth and ensured that the entire team thought he was a traitor. The voices of Henry and Grace were clear, with no room for doubt. "This is," Henry stammered, recoiling as if the video burned him. "This is false. It's manipulated." "Manipulated!" Ethan's voice was as cold as steel. "I believe everyone here recognizes their voices. And if that's not enough," he pointed to the screen again, and this time documents, emails, and evidence appeared showing how Grace had used her influence to leak distorted information to the media, how they had convinced the executives that Ethan was a problem, and how they had orchestrated his entire dismissal to ensure his name wasn't mentioned in board meetings. Murmurs in the room turned into an uproar. The executives looked at each other, some in disbelief, others in indignation. A couple of them stood up, demanding explanations from Henry and Grace. "This is a conspiracy!" Henry shouted, desperate. "He wants to destroy us! He wants to destroy our family!" "Destroy you?" Ethan turned to him with an expression of absolute calm. "No, Henry. That's what you tried to do to me. All I did was defend myself, or did you think you'd get away with it?" Grace, who had remained silent until that moment, finally stood up. Her eyes met Ethan's, filled with a mix of hatred and resignation. "And what do you think you'll gain from this, Ethan?" she asked in a dangerously low voice. "Do you want to ruin Richard? Humiliate us? Will that make you happy?" Ethan stood his ground. "I'm not here to humiliate you. I'm here to expose the truth, because in the end, that's the only weapon I have against you." The executives began demanding answers from Grace and Henry, their voices full of outrage. But before the situation could spiral out of control, Richard raised his hand. "Enough!" he ordered in an authoritative voice. The room fell silent instantly. Everyone looked to Richard, waiting for him to take control, as he always had. Richard turned to Ethan, his face hardened, but with a spark of understanding in his eyes. "Why did you come here, Ethan?" he asked, ignoring the others. "You could have destroyed this family with everything you know. But instead, you chose to confront us." Ethan stared at him, unblinking. "Because I want justice. I want the truth to be known. And I want you, Richard, to know what you truly did in your name." The room was in absolute silence. Everyone held their breath. Richard nodded slowly, as if he had expected something like this. Then, with a slow and deliberate gesture, he sat back in his chair and clasped his hands on the table. "Very well," he said quietly. "But there's something you don't understand, Ethan. Grace and Henry didn't act alone. Everything they did under my supervision." The shock was immediate. Murmurs transformed into shouts of disbelief. The executives turned to Richard, unable to believe what they were hearing. "What?" one of the executives exclaimed. "Are you saying you knew all this? That you were complicit?" Richard nodded slowly, his face grim. "Yes, I knew what they were doing. I knew they were destroying Ethan's career, and I allowed it." He turned to Ethan, infinite sadness in his eyes. "I allowed it because I thought you were a threat to my family, and now I realize I was the one who destroyed my own family from within." The executives were paralyzed, unsure of what to say. The revelation was devastating. If Richard had permitted this kind of manipulation, what else was hidden in the depths of Coleman Enterprises? "That's why, effective immediately, I'm resigning as CEO of this company," Richard declared in a clear and firm voice. "I can't continue to lead when I've failed in this way. The damage I've done to this company and to my own family is irreparable." The room filled with screams of surprise and protest. Henry staggered, eyes wide. "You can't do this! Dad, please!" Grace simply slumped into her seat, defeated. She knew that with Richard's resignation, all her power would fade away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Ethan watched Richard with a mix of satisfaction and pain. He had achieved what he set out to do, but the price had been higher than he expected. Because despite everything, Richard was not just a villain. He was a man consumed by his own power, by his own fear, and now he was paying the price. "Then, Ethan," Richard said, his voice hoarse, "the company is yours. What are you going to do?" Ethan looked at the executives, at Henry, at Grace, and finally, at Richard. Then, in a firm voice, he uttered the words no one expected. "I don't want the company," he said calmly. "I don't want your legacy nor your money. All I want is for everyone to know who you really are, and that I have already achieved." Richard nodded slowly, his eyes filled with regret. Then he stood up, and without saying another word, left the room. Ethan watched him go, feeling a strange mix of triumph and emptiness. He had won, but the victory tasted like ashes in his mouth. Ethan exited the building, leaving behind the bewildered executives and the defeated members of the Coleman family. The rain began to fall again, as a form of purification. He looked up at the sky and felt, for the first time in a long time, that he could breathe. He had brought down the Titans, but now he had to decide what to do with the ruins that remained. The revenge was complete, but the future was still uncertain. Ethan walked through the offices of Coleman Enterprises, feeling the weight of every gaze upon him. He had accomplished the unthinkable, exposing the darkest truths of a family that controlled not only a company, but much of the financial fabric of the city. The executives, still in shock from Richard's resignation, looked at him as if he were a ghost that had just resurrected to shatter their world. As he moved forward, the whispers grew louder. Some employees looked at him with respect, others with fear. But what caught his attention the most were the faces of the humblest workers, secretaries, aides, and interns, whose eyes shone with a spark of hope. To them, Ethan was not just a young man who had toppled a corrupt empire. He was a living testament that truth still held power in a place governed by lies. The echoes of voices faded as Ethan entered the conference room where the remaining executives awaited him. The table that had once been a symbol of authority and control now seemed like a battlefield where executives debated heatedly about the future of the company. With Richard and Grace gone and Henry expelled for his actions, the company was on the brink of total collapse. "What are we supposed to do now?" murmured one of the executives, trembling hands flipping through reports of financial losses. "If the media finds out about what happened today, the stock will plummet. The board could dissolve the company." "And it's not just that," another replied, rubbing his temples in despair. "We have hundreds of employees depending on us. If everything collapses, they will be the first to suffer." Ethan observed them in silence for a moment. He knew they all expected him to make a decision, to assume the role of leader and steer the ship through the storm he had unleashed. But something within him resisted. He hadn't fought for revenge just to become what he had destroyed. He didn't want control of the company. He didn't desire the power that came with being a Coleman. He had come here to expose the truth and clear his name, not to inherit a corrupt empire. And yet, could he simply walk away and let everything crumble? The vision of those workers, of the employees who now saw him as someone different, crossed his mind. It wasn't fair for them to pay for the sins of Richard, Grace, and Henry. Perhaps there was something more he could do, something beyond his desire for justice. "Ethan," called one of the executives with a tense voice, pulling him from his thoughts. "You have more power now than you realize. With Richard and his family out of the equation, shareholders would be willing to accept a new leader. Someone who can restore confidence in the company. Someone like you." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Ethan felt the weight of the decision crushing him. He could take control and reshape the company in his own way, transform it into something better. Or he could walk away and let them face the consequences of their own actions. Finally, he took a breath and let his gaze sweep across the room. Everyone's eyes were fixed on him, waiting for his verdict. "I don't want to be like them," Ethan said calmly, but with a voice full of conviction. "I didn't come here to seize power or take what the Colemans built through corruption and deceit. But I can't allow their mistakes to destroy innocent people either." He leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "I'm going to propose a solution," he continued, capturing everyone's attention. "I will take temporary control to stabilize the company and ensure that the employees don't pay the price for all this. But I will not be the leader you expect. My only condition is that when things are in order, I will leave and hand over the reins to someone who truly intends to rebuild this company with integrity." The murmurs faded. The executives exchanged surprised glances. It wasn't what they expected, but seeing the determination in Ethan's eyes, they knew there was no room for negotiation. Ethan was not like Richard or Grace. He was something entirely different. And somehow, they felt that this difference might be what they needed at this moment of desperation. "All right," one of the executives finally said, with a mix of relief and respect. "If you accept that responsibility, we will support you." Ethan nodded slowly. The decision had been made. He had entered Coleman Enterprises as a mere analyst, and now, somehow, he found himself about to lead the company he had sworn to destroy. But this would not be a traditional power grab. It would be an act of restoration, of closing the wounds opened by those who had forgotten what it meant to lead with honesty. "Then we have an agreement," he concluded, looking firmly at each one of them. But make no mistake, I am not here to stay. I am only here to ensure that this company and the people who depend on it have a better future. And so, Ethan Roberts, the rejected son and silent avenger, temporarily took control of Coleman Enterprises. But unlike everyone who had held that position before him, his aim was not power, but redemption. Ethan left the boardroom feeling that a new chapter in his life had just begun. He had confronted the Coleman family and won, but the real test was still ahead. Because rebuilding a company with rotting foundations would not be easy. He looked toward the city skyline, the rain softly falling against the windows, and he knew that while he had achieved his revenge, his true challenge was just beginning. Ethan walked through the halls of Coleman Enterprises with a renewed sense of purpose. Even though he had taken control of the company only temporarily, his presence had become a symbol of change. The employees, once fearful and filled with uncertainty, now looked at him with respect and something he had never expected to see on their faces: hope. However, Ethan knew that time was of the essence. The first days in charge were a storm of urgent meetings and decisions. He gathered the executives and announced an internal audit to clean up the corrupt practices that Henry and Grace had implemented. Questionable contracts were reviewed, shady accounts were closed, and executives loyal to the old management were dismissed without hesitation. But what surprised everyone the most was the way Ethan addressed the lower-level workers. He visited every department, spoke with the teams, and listened to each employee, from assistants to cleaning staff. As he walked through the offices, he felt the tension starting to dissipate. His presence, his willingness to listen, was something they were not used to. Ethan realized that he was not just trying to change a company, he was attempting to heal the people who had been mistreated and exploited for so long. "I want this company to be more than what it was under Richard's control," he said in one of the open meetings he organized with the employees. "We will work together to rebuild it from the ground up. Because if I've learned anything, it's that the strongest foundations are not built with bricks of ambition and corruption, but with integrity and respect." The reaction was almost immediate. Workers began to get involved, proposing ideas and sharing their concerns openly. Small improvements started to emerge: new protocols for transparency and project management, open meetings accessible to all employees, and an ethics committee to oversee high-level decisions. Ethan was planting the seeds of a change that over time could flourish. But the clock was still ticking. Shareholders were not willing to wait too long to see financial results, and Ethan knew that his time in charge was limited. He had to act quickly to stabilize the company before the board grew impatient and replaced him with someone who would try to restore the old practices. One day, while reviewing progress reports in his small office, the same office he had occupied as a mere analyst, he received an unexpected visitor. Claire Coleman, Richard's youngest daughter, entered the room with silent steps. She had avoided confrontation throughout the chaos, watching from the shadows. But now, with the company in transition and her family in ruins, she had decided to confront Ethan. "So this is your legacy, Ethan," she said in a soft voice, but loaded with emotion. "You've destroyed everything my father built, and now you're trying to save it. Why?" Ethan looked up, surprised by her presence. He hadn't expected to see Claire, the only person in the Coleman family who hadn't been directly involved in his downfall. "I'm not here to save the Colemans," he replied sincerely. "I'm here to save the people who have always been caught in the middle of their power struggles." Claire looked at him intently, with a mix of sadness and respect. "I always knew there was something special about you, something that Henry and Grace would never understand. But I have to ask you, when you achieve what you're after, what will you do? Will you leave?" Ethan held his gaze unblinking. "Yes, because this company isn't my home. It never was. But I want to ensure that when I leave, the people who remain here have the opportunity to build a better future." Claire nodded slowly, accepting his words. Without saying more, she turned and exited the office, leaving Ethan alone once again. Ethan stared at the spot where Claire had been, reflecting on all he had sacrificed to get here. He had won the battle, but he still wasn't sure if he had achieved the victory that truly mattered. He took a deep breath and refocused on the reports. The end was near, and with it the hardest decision of all, to leave behind power to fulfill the promise he had made to himself and to his mother. Ethan stood at the main entrance of Coleman Enterprises, looking one last time at the imposing building that had dominated his life for the past few months. The morning sun cast long shadows over the city, and employees began to arrive for a new day. It was time to close this chapter and move on. After weeks of hard work, things had changed significantly. The internal audit had cleared much of the corruption and questionable practices, and new transparency policies had been implemented. Employees, who had once moved with fear and resignation, now worked with a renewed sense of purpose. The firings of corrupt executives and the restructuring of leadership had been tough but necessary. Ethan had kept his promise. He had temporarily taken charge to stabilize the company and leave it in better hands. And now, after lengthy discussions with the board of directors, he was ready to leave. His time at the company had come to an end, but his impact would endure. In front of the building entrance, a small group of employees had gathered to bid him farewell. Many of them were familiar faces, people with whom he had worked and fought to change the course of the company. Among them, Claire Coleman stood out, watching him with an expression of mixed gratitude and sadness. "Thank you, Ethan," Claire murmured as he approached to say goodbye. "Thank you for not destroying us completely. Thank you for giving us the chance to change." Ethan nodded, a small smile on his face. "It wasn't easy, Claire, but I hope this company follows the path you all deserve." She extended her hand, and Ethan shook it firmly. "I promise I will do everything I can to make that happen," Claire said sincerely. With that promise, Ethan turned to the gathered employees. "What happens from now on depends on you," he said in a clear, firm voice. "This company no longer belongs to one man or one family. It belongs to each of you who worked tirelessly to keep it standing. Never forget why you're here, and always remember to value what truly matters: the people." The faces around him nodded solemnly. To them, Ethan had been a different leader, one who sought not power or prestige, but simply justice and truth. His mother, Martha's legacy was fulfilled. Without saying more, Ethan turned and began to walk away from the building that, for so long, had represented the core of his struggle and pain. He felt a light breeze on his face and, for the first time, a genuine sense of peace. As he walked down the sidewalk, away from the Coleman Enterprises tower, his phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket and looked at the screen. It was a notification of a funds transfer. A significant sum had been deposited into his bank account, a payment of compensation for his services to the company. Without hesitation, Ethan dialed a number and transferred the amount to a charity fund for laid-off employees from the company. He didn't want a single cent coming from the Colemans. He turned off his phone and continued on his way, leaving the building behind. From that moment on, the name Coleman Enterprises would not be a symbol of corrupted power, but of a rebirth forged by integrity and redemption. Ethan had won the war he fought in honor of his mother, and now, with his mission complete, he was ready to write a new chapter in his own life. For a moment, Ethan paused at a corner, and for the last time, looked back at the skyscraper that had dominated his world. He exhaled slowly, feeling the chains that had bound him to that place finally break. "Goodbye, Coleman Enterprises," he whispered softly. And then, with a slight yet determined smile, he turned and walked away, not looking back. Thank you for joining us in this story filled with secrets, betrayals, and redemption. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more impactful tales. We'll see you in the next story. where hidden truths always come to light. See you soon.